Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Fairwinds. My name is Cody J. Brown, the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead, but before we begin, I have just a few notes of housekeeping. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to share it with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after the webinar concludes today. If you have any questions for our speakers today, you can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. Be sure to get your questions in early and we'll try to address as many as we can. If you have any comments or suggestions or any kind of feedback for the presenters, we want you to go ahead and put that into the chat tab. And you should anticipate that 2 polls throughout today's program. They'll be announcing towards the beginning and another towards the end of the presentation. So be sure to fill those out. And finally, at the end of the program, we'll have a giveaway for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So on to our topic at hand. We'll be discussing Uniting DevSecOps, Fact or Fiction. And I'm joined today by Robert Brennan, Director of Open Source Software at Fairwinds, and Stevie Caldwell, a tech lead at Fairwinds. It is my pleasure to turn the floor over to them to get us started. Thank you both so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Cody. It's great to be here. Cool. So we're going to be talking today about some DevSecOps, myths and truths. Just to give you all a sense for who we are. As Cody said, I'm Robert Brennan, Director of Open Source here at Fairwinds. I've been working as a software developer for over a decade now. The majority of that time in open source, and for the last 3 years or so, working directly with Kubernetes here at Fairwinds. Stevie, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. You hear me okay? Great. So my name's Stevie Caldwell. I am a senior SRE / tech lead here at Fairwinds. I mostly had my career in operations, and I've been working with Kubernetes for a few years now. And I love it. So
awesome. Cool. Well, to kick it off, we're going to ask a quick polling question just to see where folks are at in their Kubernetes journey. We've got 4 options here. One is I'm just learning about containers and Kubernetes. I'm planning to use Kubernetes in the next 6 to 12 months. I'm only using it in testing or development environment, or I am an expert using it in production now. So we got a few answers coming in. All right, looks like, oh, no, just got one more. I'll give it another second. All right, going once, going twice. All right, it looks like about a little less than half of you are just learning about containers and Kubernetes. A little bit less than that, about a third are planning to use it in the next 6 to 12 months. About 10% using it only in a testing or development environment, and about 20% of you are up to using it in production. So it sounds like we've got a good range of different experience levels with Kubernetes today, mostly in that beginning phase, but plenty of folks using it in prod as well. Cool. Thanks, y'all. All right, so now we're going to ask a handful of questions that Stevie and I will talk about together, whether it's a truth or a falsehood. First one is whether dev and security can be aligned. What do you think, Stevie? Can dev and security actually, from an organizational perspective, get aligned in terms of their needs, their values, their motivations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that historically, there's always been a little friction between the dev team and like your ops team or your security team, where the infrastructure is managed, because the goals of those two different teams, the focuses are a little different, right? Like your development team is really focused on pushing new features. They want to get their code out into production as quickly as possible. They want to iterate quickly. And then you have your ops/security teams that are more focused on like stability and security. And, that can be in conflict, but I think that's one of the things that makes DevSecOps as a idea, really attractive, because it helps align everybody and makes that pattern a little less hard for folks. You shift left with your security and you get your dev team involved in that. So your security and ops folks have less to like hold them, slow them down when it gets to their end. So I think, yes, they can be aligned is my final answer, is fact.
Cool. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think you're right. There's like a natural tension there between developers and security teams or operations teams. But I think, while at poorly run organizations, that tension might really come to the surface and be, a point of conflict. At well-run organizations, there is a way to communicate a message about, everybody contributing to the health of the company. It's not like security and operations never want to ship another new feature again. And it's not like developers want to ship buggy code that's going to get, all the data exfiltrated into some attacker's account. So there's definitely some tension there that's natural. But I think a well-run organization can manage that tension and get everybody pointed in the direction that, best aligned with the company's interests as a whole, rather than any individual's interests or any particular team's interests. Cool. All right. Next question is whether security is a moving target. What do you think, Stevie?
I think that one's clearly a fact. All you have to do is look at like the number of CVEs that come out all the time. There's nothing like when we update a cluster to mitigate one CVE by like using a new AMI, a patched AMI or something like that, and then like a few days later, here comes another one. So yeah, it's a moving target, and you always have to just continuously be checking the security notifications, doing scanning. That's integrated into like your deployment strategy, into your CI/CD platform, and that kind of thing, to try and keep ahead of it.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. There's new CVEs getting announced all the time, so making sure you're constantly scanning against that known database of CVEs is super important. I'd also add to that while in the short term it's a moving target, it's also a moving target in the long term, right? We used to worry about security on our on-prem installs, and antivirus software was the big thing. And then you move towards the cloud and you start scanning your AWS infrastructure for public S3 buckets. Now we're in a world of Kubernetes, and you've got to do container scanning and understand networking within your cluster. So as the technology and platforms we use evolved, we have to change our whole security strategy and completely rework our model of what an attacker might do to get into our environment. So it's both in the long term and in the short term. It's a moving target for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about the ways the Kubernetes clusters were run in the beginning, and the things that we have learned and have implemented to like mitigate a lot of those things, like yeah, there's a lot that we don't know. It'll continue to evolve. So yeah, there'll always be something new.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like just trying to keep up with what the community thinks are best practices, because those are evolving all the time as well. Cool. Cool. So fact or fiction, you can do it all yourself.
I mean, as somebody in like, DevOps, ops, like, of course I can. But the reality is probably not. I'm going to say that's fiction. I think it's a lot. It's a big lift to, security isn't a thing like we were just talking about that you just do once and you're done. It's not like it's one ticket in your backlog that you take care of, and it's a constant keeping up with all these things. And security it should be something that everyone is involved in order to actually make it like work in an organization, I think.
Yeah, totally. There's definitely, I'm getting a little echo from you, Steve, if you wouldn't mind muting. There's definitely a natural tendency for engineers to say, well, I could build that myself. There's a number of times where I've seen, some expensive SaaS product and been like, well, I could do that in a 30-line bash script. It'd be fine. There's so much that you don't know, though, that goes into building that product, whatever it is or whatever it's doing. It's hard for us as engineers to like take that approach of humility and understand that there's a bunch of really smart people working on these things. And I don't need to be an expert on networking security as long as I have the right partners, somebody who has made that, their area of expertise, who has studied that for an entire career, or an organization that's built up a lot of institutional knowledge around that particular topic. I can partner with those folks, and then I don't have to worry about all this stuff myself. It's an easy way to actually make mistakes, is if you just assume that you know everything and try to do it all by yourself or within your organization, and you're suddenly working on things that are way outside of your core competence. So yeah, I totally agree with you. I think this one's definitely a fiction. Cool. So next question is whether the security team is the only team responsible for security. Fact or fiction?
So I'm going to say fiction, because this is essentially piggybacking off of the previous question. I think security needs to be on the mind of everyone involved, even like starting at the feature build out itself. When you build a feature, you need to be thinking about security. When you make your tests, when you create your testing and you build your pipeline, security needs to be a thing. And then, after it's been deployed, security needs to be a thing. The infra that you're running on needs to be, looked at from a security lens. So I think everybody needs to be involved in security, even people who aren't actually doing the coding. Like just having everybody be in the mindset of some of the other things that could cause vulnerabilities, like people. Right? Password management, things like that all should be a part of like your security posture. So that's a falsehood, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. I think the security team is responsible really for setting up that kind of like broad security approach. What are the things that we're going to do as a company in order to make sure that we're secure? But it's on the individual teams and the individual people within that company to actually follow that approach. Like one example might be, a security team is concerned about SQL injection. So they might, set up an application firewall that will try and detect and drop any requests that look like they're an attacker trying to inject SQL. But at the end of the day, some of those are going to get through, and it's up to the development team to actually make sure that their code is free from any SQL injection type bugs. And without everybody kind of bought in and, understanding, what the needs of the company are in terms of security, without everybody being educated on what security means for that company, you're going to end up with vulnerabilities. All right, I like this one. DevSecOps is just a meaningless buzzword. Fact or fiction?
I think we're going to say fiction, but it is a buzzword. I think it sort of depends on whether or not you think DevOps is a meaningless buzzword. Like there are a lot of people who object to the way that term is used as like a job description versus like a framework or a mentality about the work we do. So it is a buzzword. I don't think it's meaningless, though. I think that the concept of it is very meaningful. I think it's important, and I think it's again, with how quickly security vulnerabilities evolve, with the attack surfaces expanding. Like I think everybody needs to be all in on security. So I think DevSecOps is a framework for making that happen. And so I think it is meaningful. So I think this is fiction.
Yeah, I struggle with this one. I think it's somewhere in the middle. It's been repeated so many times in so many different contexts that I think it has become kind of buzzwordy, like you said, Stevie. But it definitely came from a place that is meaningful, which is about getting dev and security and operations all aligned in order to have a sort of holistic strategy for how you're going to build and deploy software. It's a thing that a lot of organizations really struggle with, getting these three different personas aligned. You're right. People just started hiring for the DevOps role, and it's not really supposed to be a role. It's supposed to be, a strategic alignment between two different roles. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Cool. All right. Fact or fiction? Kubernetes is secure by default.
Fiction. It is not. Again, vulnerabilities come out all the time. And Kubernetes will let you do some things that you shouldn't do, and even in terms of like settings that you have in your deployment specs for your pods or for your containers, like, mounting a host path and things like that. Like Kubernetes won't stop you from doing that stuff. So, it's as secure as you know how to make it. So yeah, it's not secure by default, and there are a lot of knobs and buttons to push and twist to get it to some level of security. And again, it's an ever evolving thing. Every new iteration of Kubernetes itself has like some new security things that it'll implement, and also with new code comes new vulnerability. So yeah, no, it is not secure by default. That is fiction.
Yeah, totally agree. There's a natural trade-off, I think, between ease of use and tight security. And there are a lot of things that Kubernetes does, I think, to make things a little bit easier on you, but which are less secure than ideal. Like, for instance, it will allow any container to run as root by default. You have to turn an option on that says, no, this container is not allowed to run as root. And that's a great way to make it really much harder to run containers out of the box, because a lot of containers are just set up to run as root. But turning that ability off is a great way to make sure you have a stronger security posture in the event that somebody manages to escape that container. You don't want them to have root access on the host node. So there's a lot of settings like that, which just, the defaults, things will run okay, but you might be a little bit more exposed than you realize in terms of an attack.
Absolutely. And I think like there's a pressure with, when people or companies decide to adopt Kubernetes to get it up and going as quickly as possible too. There are tons of tutorials and guides that are like, you spin up a Kubernetes cluster in 10 minutes. And like, those never take into account the things you need to do to actually make your cluster production ready. So yeah, like a base Kubernetes cluster is not secure.
Yeah, it's often hard to realize, like, just because it's working and your app's running and users can access it doesn't mean you've set things up the right way. Doesn't mean you don't understand. Doesn't mean you fully understand the security profile, et cetera. So making sure that you've got some kind of eyes on, what is your security posture? How are you doing? Something in there to tell you, are you adhering to best practices at the very least? Cool. So kind of building off that, next one is we can build it quick and dirty and then secure it later. What do you think about that one, Stevie?
So I think technically this is fact. Like you can absolutely deploy, build a cluster out and then go back and, secure it, put in best practices. That, in my opinion, though, is going to wind up being a lot more work than just doing it from the beginning, because there are going to be a lot of things that you realize you have to, if you need to pass like certain API flags, then you're going to just have to go and redeploy your API server. And, so why not just do it from the beginning? There's a lot of stuff you'll just have to tear things down in order to implement the best practices. So, and also like the reality of life working in tech is that there feels like, I think for a lot of people, there's an ever growing backlog of tasks that need attention, and security often tends to fall to the bottom of that backlog if anyone's even tracking it at all, right? I feel like security is often an afterthought until a vulnerability comes out, until a CVE comes out, and then you're dealing with it. But up until then, like the reality is that you're going to be doing a lot of other things with your cluster, just stabilizing workloads, for example. And so all that security stuff that you meant to get to when you're like, we're going to do that later, like becomes just tech debt that never gets addressed, or it takes a long time to get addressed. So I think while you could do this, I think it's better to just go ahead and do it from the beginning the right way, or as close to the right way as you can.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things that we help folks do at Fairwinds is to create and deploy policies for their Kubernetes environment. So like we were talking about before, maybe you don't want containers to ever run as root. You can create a policy for that and enforce it across all your teams. That's really easy to do on day one before teams start deploying into Kubernetes, because they'll get that notification. They'll see, oh, I need to re-architect my app to not run as root. They'll make it happen, and then they're in prod. If you try to deploy that policy, a year after you started your Kubernetes journey, though, you're going to have all this backlog of tech debt. You're going to be going to all your development teams and saying, "Hey, you need to change your configuration." They're going to think, "Well, I already did the Kubernetes thing, and I don't have to do it now." It's much harder to try and tack on those policies after the fact and try to get everybody back in line with a new set of security standards once you do decide to secure. So I totally agree. The easiest way to do it is on day one, have a sense for what you want your security posture to be, what kinds of policies you want in place, and make sure you're following them from the beginning.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point of encouraging DevSecOp adoption, right? Because if you throw a bunch of tasks at your devs, like you were saying, oh, you have to re-architect, you have to create, change this user so they can't run as root. You have to create a user and all this other stuff. That's going to be very hard for them to go back and do a bunch of. If you have 50 microservices running in your cluster, they're not going to want to do that. And so I think if you want to really get dev on board, you have to set the policies in the very beginning so that it's something that they're used to and that they expect, and not some new thing that's going to be perceived as slowing them down, right?
Totally. Cool. All right. Building all the tooling in-house will take no time. The way that's phrased, I think that's probably definitely fiction, but yeah, talk about this one, Stevie.
Yeah, it's definitely fiction. Tooling is it's hard, it's complex, and so yes, of course it'll take time, especially if you're doing it right. If you're so yeah, there's a lot of really great tooling that's already out there that you can use. Hint, hint. So. But and we draw on some of those open source tools as well. It's so yeah, I never believe in starting something from scratch just for the to be able to say, look what I built. If there's something already out there that fits the bill, there's so many other things that you need to get done in your clusters, in your environment, that you should make use of the resources available to you. So yeah, this is fiction, and I think unless you have to, you probably should not be building security scanning tools from scratch or something like that.
Yeah, totally agree. I think one of the things that folks often, forget to take into account if they're going to try and build something in-house, it's not just the upfront cost of building it, but that ongoing maintenance burden. You're going to want new features. You're going to have to fix bugs. Your environment's going to change. You're going to have to adapt the tooling a little bit. And that maintenance burden can get really, big over time. So taking that into account is super important. You mentioned, Stevie, that there's a lot of great open source tooling out there that can be used. There's some really great enterprise grade open source tooling out there for security, for reliability, for efficiency. Basically anything you want to do with a Kubernetes cluster, there's probably an open source solution that can help you. But it's also worth noting that open source itself comes with some amount of cost to it. It's needs to be kept up to date. It needs to be maintained. So it's also worth, I think, having a commercial partner, somebody who can really help guide your journey there, help you figure out, okay, what tools should you be deploying, what how to keep them up to date, how to configure them in a way that's optimal for your environment, etc. Cool. Next one, ops can write policy, but devs won't follow it. I'm honestly not sure which bucket to put this one in.
I think this one also goes sort of square in the middle. It touches on a lot of stuff that we've talked about already, which is, devs may have a feeling that like your policies are going to slow them down. And so that's part of the benefit of introducing these things from the very beginning. But also I think that the way this is sort of written is like ops/security as gatekeepers. And DevSecOps is about this being a collaborative relationship, right? And ops and security teams being more advisors than gatekeepers. I think that, if you write a policy that suddenly starts spitting things out at your devs and overwhelms them, you're totally not going to follow it. They're going to be like, what is, because it makes sense to me that you wouldn't do that. But, I think it's important that you talk to your devs, that, the ops and security talk with dev teams about like the policies they're writing, talk to them about the purpose of the policies, and then talk to them about like what actions they can take based on like the output of those policies, right? If I come to a dev with a list of things, of vulnerabilities, and say, here, these things need to be taken care of, they're going to be overwhelmed and they're not going to have any like concrete steps. So this is part of the communication piece between all the teams that needs to happen so that like devs can follow the policies because they understand the reason for it. They understand what the mitigating steps are, and it's not like a headache for them. So I think this is true. This is fact, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Making sure that ops are not gatekeepers, but that they're, I think you said an enabling or advising the developers. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. Another thing I'd bring up here is the use of policy as code. I think once you've figured out what your policies should be between all of development, security, and operations, I've seen organizations that just have a gigantic Google Doc or something like that lists out all the rules, and then nobody goes and reads it. They forget about it within months, and it goes stale. The best way to do policy is to enforce it as code. Within Kubernetes, you can use OPA as a great solution, or we have a project as well called Polaris that's totally open source. It lets you take basically write your policies in a way that you can check into Git, and then you can enforce automatically in CI/CD. You can enforce it as an admission controller in Kubernetes, so blocking any resources that don't conform to certain policies. And you can also scan your infrastructure for any resources that are already in there that don't conform to your policies. So making sure you're automating that policy as much as possible to make sure that nobody's forgetting about it and it's not getting left by the wayside. And for the really, really important ones, making sure you're blocking things that don't conform to the policy.
Right. But also, again, and to piggyback off that, the other portion of that is making sure that you're communicating to the devs, if a deployment gets blocked because of an admission controller, and it that can be really confusing if they don't understand why or what that is, what the message means, why it's being blocked. So that's part of the communication piece, right? That you don't just ops doesn't just write an OPA policy that says don't allow this deployment to go through if it's missing this label or whatever, but like that you communicate to your dev team that this policy is in place, and that you make it very clear what the mitigation steps are so that you're not frustrating them and you're making it easy for them to resolve these things on their own.
Cool. All right. Next up, communication is the main ingredient in DevSecOps.
So I won't go too long because I think I just said that fact. Yeah. Communication is super important. That's how that's everyone's happy place. When everyone knows what's going on and why they're doing the things they're doing, you're enabling folks to make good decisions. So yeah, fact.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of our major themes for this discussion has been that DevSecOps is all about communication. It's all about taking these three different personas who have different goals, different incentives, and getting them to work together to create, one great product. Getting them all aligned towards the same goal is super important. So yeah, I think 100% fact on this one. All right, I like this one. We can just hire a DevSecOp and we'll be fine. What is a DevSecOp, Stevie?
It's as elusive as a DevOp. Yeah, I think this is fiction. This goes the route of the whole, like, can one singular person do it? It's all the security team's responsibility, all that jazz. Like, I think we said those were all fiction. I think you can hire a person who leads the teams, who reaches across all of your teams with a DevSecOp mindset and helps like have a higher level, view of everything, and helps bridge everybody. It helps form that bridge between your development team, your security team if you have one, and your operations team or whatever, and all your other teams, honestly, like we were saying, right? So yeah, I think that a role exists that implements a DevSecOp philosophy. I don't think there's a DevSecOp person, though.
Yeah, this is definitely not like an individual contributor role. It might be somebody you hire as like somebody who actually has power and is able to coordinate people and make sure that everybody's on the same page and communicating the right way. But again, DevSecOps is not a role. It's a strategy. It's a way of organizing your engineering teams to get to an outcome. Cool. All right, Netflix has it perfect. We just have to be like Netflix. Fact or fiction?
Considering they just increased my subscription fee, no, it's fiction. Netflix is not perfect. And yeah, but all jokes aside, I know that a lot of people look to large companies like Netflix, like Google, and their processes. It works for them, but I think different size, like you're not like our company isn't the size of a Netflix, right? So the things that they have going on, they probably have like a security team of hundreds of people. We don't have a security team of hundreds of people, right? Probably none of you have security teams of hundreds of people. Like that's not the baseline, I don't think. So I think you have to tailor your DevSecOp, your security response, your security, platform and way of thinking to fit with who you have, with the teams that you have, and with like your own cadence, right? You don't have to. No one, you can't, and everyone can't do it the way Netflix does it. And sometimes Netflix doesn't even do it well themselves. Like, they've got plenty, they make mistakes too. So yeah, this is fiction, I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. Netflix, or a company that size, has a set of resources that not all of us have. So they can just throw a bunch of money and people at problems that the rest of us maybe don't have that same level of budget. And they also have problems that most of us don't have to solve in terms of their level of scale, the sophistication of attacks against them, things like that. So it's not something that we all need to aspire to be. I think they do a great job in general. They post some really interesting posts about how they do what they do at scale. So it's always interesting reading those blog posts, and it can be good inspiration, kind of good food for thought. But it is not something. I don't think anyone should make the argument, well, Netflix does it this way, so therefore we should do it this way too. I think that can lead you down some bad paths. All right. Fact or fiction? Your CISO definitely knows what they're doing.
I mean, I hope so.
Definitely does.
I don't know how to. Yes. Let's say yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a tough one because some CISOs are obviously more knowledgeable than others. I think one thing to keep in mind is that nobody really knows everything when it comes to a moving target like security. We talked a bit before about how The security game is always changing in terms of new vulnerabilities getting announced, in terms of just the landscape changing, the attack vectors changing. And so I think it's important to remember that there's just a million unknown unknowns. And no matter how brilliant your CISO is, no matter how storied they are, how many times they've done this before, if they're not staying on top of their game, if you're not staying on top of your game, there's always there's always new things that you don't know. So I think you need to keep that in mind. You can't be overconfident when it comes to security.
Definitely not. And certainly if you want to have someone in place who is open to listening to the feedback from the people on their team and who are doing the work as well. I've personally never had a CISO at any company that I've worked for, so this one's a little out of my my area of experience.
Cool. All right. DevSecOps makes your software development lifecycle slower. Fact or fiction?
I think this one is fiction, because I think it's actually the opposite, that if you wait until the end of the development lifecycle when you're going to deploy to do all of your security work, to have your security team look over, what you've deployed, that's actually slower because there's a larger sort of attack surface at that point that the security team has to review. And then if they find something and have to throw it back, you have to go through, you've probably already moved on to the next feature or what have you. And now you have to go through and remember what you did and review this code. And that's weeks old or something like that. And also it's far more expensive to fix things in production than it is to fix them ahead, before they get to production. So, you certainly don't want to have a vulnerability that's been sitting in prod for 2 weeks while you do all your security testing and things like that. So I think making part of your security posture, making your security posture part of your whole pipeline, shifting left, starting from the beginning with container image scanning and things like that, will actually make your development processor faster in the end. It'll be a little slower because you have to add in these cycles in your CI/CD pipeline, for example. But it'll be much better than waiting until the end of your cycle to have to throw a whole thing back and go over that. So I think it's mostly fiction with a smidge of fact in it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it might make this particular cycle faster to go without DevSecOps and just ship it without really doing much of the security and operations overview. But it's going to catch up to you really quick. Because basically, you're building up debt every time you don't have security, operations, and development aligned for each cycle. So I think you're totally right. There's a drop of fact in here. That it might slow things down a little bit in the short term, but it's going to make things so much faster and so much cheaper in the long term to make sure that you're doing things the right way on day one. All right, fact or fiction, you'll never achieve true DevSecOps.
When I see this question, I envision someone true enlightenment in DevSecOps. Yeah. Fiction. You can. It's an ever-evolving target. But I think at the moment that you start actually having these conversations across your teams and building that bridge with a common understanding of a goal of being security-minded, I think you've achieved some level of DevSecOps. And then, you begin to put your processes in place at every level or at the different levels of your development pipeline and your deployment pipeline. And then you have it. That's not to say that you're ever going to achieve 100%. You're never going to have a 100% secure environment, right? Because as we said, there are always vulnerabilities being discovered. And a vulnerability that, you don't know about is just a vulnerability that someone hasn't found yet, right? They're always out there. But I think you can have a really good team that's ready to respond to vulnerabilities and put the best protective measures in place for your environment and your applications.
Yeah, I like the comparison with enlightenment. I think it's tempting to think of it as like, a finish line that you just get to cross and like you're there and you never have to think about it again. But it's a process. It's something you have to continuously do, especially as your company grows and evolves, the product changes. You're going to need to change those processes. You're going to need to, if the security team gets twice as big and the development team gets twice as big, like those communication patterns are going to change. And you're going to have to alter your process as time goes on. You're going to have to hire new roles. So it's really a process that has to continuously grow and evolve with you and your company. All right, I think that's it for the fact or fiction portion of the program. So we just wanted to talk a little bit today about Fairwinds Insights, which is software that we provide to help folks with Kubernetes governance, help folks really understand their Kubernetes environment from a security perspective, an efficiency perspective, and a reliability perspective, really from throughout the entire software development lifecycle. So from CI/CD through the time of deployment, all the way through scanning your production environment. It's really a platform for service ownership, which allows developers, security, and operations to all come together in a single UI and interact with each other in a way that allows them to all understand each other's needs and make sure they're all on the same page. So there's three kind of main pillars to Fairwinds Insights. One is the security pillar. We make sure that everybody has eyes on their security profile, understands their company security needs, the set of policies that they put in place. We allow security teams to write policy as code to make sure that anything new that gets deployed or anything that gets changed conforms to your security standards, to your policies, etc. The next pillar would be cost optimization. So making sure that you are using the right amounts of memory and CPU. You're not overspending on your cloud bill. You're not scaling up when you don't need to be, etc. And making sure, on the other hand, that your applications have enough resources in order to perform effectively and aren't, toppling over the second you get a real burst in traffic. And then the third pillar is really around policy and guardrails. So making sure that developers are able to do what they need to do to get applications launched and into production, but with so much flexibility and freedom that they end up, causing an outage or causing a security vulnerability, et cetera. So I really like this notion of guardrails so that, they're kind of helped to stay in their lane. They're given the freedom that they need to do their job, but not so much that they can, break something. Cool. So I can take you all through a quick demo of the user interface here. I will share my screen. You know what? Google Chrome is not going to let me share my screen. So sadly, I don't think I'm going to be able to share the demo with you all. Let's see. Yeah. Sorry. I think I've got a security setting issue. So we'll skip the demo, but if anybody would like to see a demo of Fairwinds Insights, see how it can help you understand your security profile, how efficiently you're running, et cetera. I'm happy to take you all through a demo, on a one-on-one basis. Feel free to reach out to me or Stevie after the presentation. We do have a polling question to wrap things up, and then we'll do some Q&A. So the question here is, what is your greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? Getting help with the basics, a general best practices assessment, improving the security posture of your clusters, saving money, or improving the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes. Give it another minute for responses to come through. All right, going once, going twice. Still one or two more. I'll go through them now. So it looks like most of you said improving the security posture of your clusters is your greatest opportunity, about 45% there. Next, it looks like a tie between a general best practices assessment and improving the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes. And then a few of you said getting help with the basics and saving money. Cool. That definitely aligns with what we've been hearing. Security seems to be top of mind for most folks. All right, I think we can open it up for some Q&A now. We do have, while we do that, we do have a best practices white paper here that you all can download. I think we'll share this out at the end as well, but you can copy that link there to check out our best practices white paper.
Awesome. So I am scrolling through our questions, and so I posted this in the chat, but if anyone has any questions, it could be fun if you pose them in a fact or fiction type way so that we can discuss them in line with our theme today. So we have received one so far. So this question asks, security champions programs don't work, fact or fiction?
I've never actually heard of a security champions program. I've heard of the idea of a security champion, the idea that, one or a few people at a company who might be particularly passionate about security, driving those security initiatives. And I think it can do both good and bad. I think the good side is that, there are naturally people who are just more interested in security and giving them space to kind of express that and try and promote those types of that security mentality at the company is a really good thing. What you don't want, though, is for other folks to assume, well, that person has it covered, I don't have to worry about security. But really, everybody should be a security champion would be the platitude I'd throw at you.
Yeah, I like that. Everyone should be a security champion. That's a good philosophy.
Awesome. So I'm not seeing any more questions right now. So quickly, I'll just run through our Amazon gift card winners, and then we will check again just to give another minute or so to get any questions in. So our 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing is, our first winner is Blessing O. Our second winner is Dave S. Our third winner is Gustavo S. And our fourth and final winner is Bryson O. Keep an eye on your email to claim your gift card. And if you don't find that email, just check your spam folder. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in at this point. So I'll just return the floor over to you for a few more minutes so you can have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to leave the audience with before we wrap up today.
I did get one more private question here. What about, are there any Kube security tools that you recommend to get started? And there's definitely 2 or 3 that I think are great as a kind of starting point. One, I'll give a quick plug for our own project Polaris, which does security as well as a bit of efficiency and reliability. Polaris will just give you a bunch of out-of-the-box best practices checks to run against your cluster. It'll give you a dashboard that, it's basically a one line to install a dashboard, and you can see for every single resource in your cluster how it's doing from a security level, from a reliability and efficiency level. You can see specific recommendations for what to change. Another great one is Trivy from Aqua Security, which does container scanning. I think that's definitely like a table stakes thing that you need to be doing as an organization if you're running Kubernetes, is understanding, what are the vulnerabilities that are inside of each of the containers that you're running. Are there any critical ones, et cetera? And then again, a quick plug for Insights, which integrates both of those open source tools as part of its platform. Well, I think that's all we've got today. Thank you all for joining. This has been really fun. And thanks, Stevie, for being a good discussion buddy.
No problem. It was a good time.
Awesome. So just confirming there are no more questions. So we'll go ahead and begin our wrap up today. I just want to remind everybody that the session was recorded. Following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or you can find the recording living on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars. I would like to send my deep gratitude to Fairwinds for sponsoring today's webinar. I'd like to thank Robert and Stevie for being here with us and putting together these series of questions. And I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being here with us for the entirety of today's program. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at another TechStrong Learning webinar. This is Cody J. Brown signing off.